The boy didn't run. Every instinct a 9-year-old owns should have told him to run, but Ethan Brooks planted both feet in the dirt, spread his thin arms wide, and placed his entire body between the looming rancher and the small bundle of food his sisters were clutching behind him. His voice didn't shake when he spoke. "Please don't take our food, mister." He swallowed hard. "We saved all day for this." Samuel Walker, a man who hadn't felt anything in 20 years, felt something crack open inside his chest that he would never be able to close again. If this story moves you, if you've ever known what it feels like to protect the people you love with nothing but your own 2 hands, please subscribe to this channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because stories like this one, they deserve to go everywhere. The summer of 1884 had been brutal to Central Texas in the particular way that only Texas summers know how to be: relentless, unforgiving, the kind of heat that doesn't just sit on a man's shoulders, but presses down through them, through his spine, through the soles of his boots, and into the cracked earth below. Samuel Walker had worked that heat for 30 years. He understood it the way a man understands an old enemy, not with fear, but with a tired mutual respect. He was 50 years old, and he looked every hour of it. His hands were the hands of a man who had never once asked for help, wide across the palm, scarred at every knuckle, darkened by decades of sun and fence wire and cattle rope. His face carried the same story. Deep lines at the corners of his eyes. A jaw that had been set hard for so long, the muscles beneath it had forgotten any other shape. Gray threaded through his dark hair at the temples, heavier now than it had been the year before, and his shoulders, still broad, still square, carried a weight that had nothing to do with the physical labor of running a cattle ranch alone. Samuel Walker had been alone for 19 years. Not alone the way a man is alone on a long trail ride where the solitude is temporary and sweet and ends at a campfire. Alone the way a house is alone when everything living inside it has gone. The kind of alone that doesn't announce itself anymore because it has simply become the permanent condition of a life. The people of Harlan County knew him. They knew his name, knew his land, knew the quality of his cattle and the reliability of his word in a business deal. Beyond that, they knew nothing because Samuel Walker had made certain there was nothing beyond that to know. He didn't attend Sunday services. He didn't come to the Harvest Social or the Founders' Day celebration or the dances held in the church hall on warm Friday evenings when the whole county seemed to pour itself into laughter and fiddle music. He bought what he needed at Callaway's dry goods store, exchanged the minimum words required to complete the transaction, and rode back to his land, his ranch hand. A quiet older man named Doss had worked the Walker property for 11 years and knew better than to ask personal questions. Doss showed up, did the work, collected fair pay, and went home. It was an arrangement that suited both men perfectly. That was the shape of Samuel Walker's life in the summer of 1884. Then, on a Thursday evening in the last week of July, everything changed. He had finished the day's work later than usual, because one of the fence lines along the eastern pasture had given way, and 3 steers had gotten through into the dry creek bed, and rounding them back up in the fading light had tested what remained of his patience. He was walking back toward the main house when he heard it. At first he thought it was a fox. The sound was small, furtive, almost nothing. A soft scraping, a quiet rustling from somewhere behind the barn, near the pile of old fence posts and discarded lumber he'd been meaning to clear out for 6 months. Samuel slowed his step without stopping, entirely tilting his head, listening the way a man does when he isn't sure what he's hearing. He heard it again. He changed direction. What he found behind the barn stopped him where he stood. 4 children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. A boy lean and sun-darkened with serious eyes that were far too old for his face. He was crouched over a small cloth bundle that had been laid out on a flat piece of wood, hardly a table but treated like one, and he was dividing something among the 3 smaller figures huddled close beside him. A younger boy, maybe 6, with the same dark eyes. 2 girls, one perhaps 7, one small enough that Samuel guessed she was barely 4, her hair in 2 uneven braids that someone had done their best with. They had scraps. Actual scraps. Kitchen scraps. The kind of things that get thrown out behind a cookhouse without a second thought. Some bread that had gone hard. A chicken bone with almost nothing left on it. A few bruised peaches that had fallen from the tree along the south fence and rotted most of the way through. The older boy was dividing these things with the focused, serious care of someone performing a sacred task, and none of the smaller children made a sound as they waited. Samuel's boot heel caught a dry piece of wood as he rounded the corner of the barn. The crack of it split the quiet evening air like a pistol shot. All 4 children froze. Then 3 of them scrambled backward. The younger boy, the older girl, the little one pressing themselves against the barn wall with their eyes wide and their breath coming fast and shallow. The oldest boy did the opposite. He rose to his feet, and he turned to face Samuel directly, and he spread both his thin arms out to his sides deliberately, like a barrier, like a fence line, placing himself between the man and his siblings and the small sad collection of food they'd gathered. His chin came up. "Please don't take our food, mister." The boy's voice was steady, steadier than it had any right to be. "We saved all day for this." Samuel Walker stood entirely still. How was a man who had ridden through cattle stampedes and survived a drought that killed half the county's livestock in a single season? He'd sat across a table from men who meant to cheat him and stared them down without blinking. He had buried his father and his mother and the last piece of his old life in a single terrible year, and he had kept standing. He was not prepared for this. The boy didn't flinch. He held his position with the steady resolve of someone who had made a decision and was not going to move from it. Not for size, not for authority, not for anything. Behind him, the little girl had pressed her face into her older sister's shoulder. But the sister was watching Samuel with the same careful measuring look as her brother. "I ain't," Samuel's voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw from a day of shouting across open pasture. He stopped, cleared his throat, started again. "I ain't taking anything." The boy didn't lower his arms. "Ethan?" The younger girl, the one who was maybe 7, pulled at her brother's sleeve. "Ethan, he might be telling the truth." "Hush, Lily," the boy said without looking away from Samuel. "Your name's Ethan?" Samuel asked. A pause, then a careful nod. "How long have you children been out here?" "Nothing." "I'm not going to hurt you," Samuel said. The words felt strange in his mouth, not because they weren't true, but because he couldn't remember the last time he'd had to say anything like them. "I just want to know how long you've been on my property." Ethan's jaw tightened. Behind him, the little one, the youngest girl, peeked out from her sister's shoulder. She had enormous dark eyes and a smear of dirt across her nose, and when she looked at Samuel, she didn't look frightened the way the others did. She looked curious. "We didn't take nothing," Ethan said. "We only took what was already thrown away. Things nobody wanted." "I know," Samuel said. "We didn't break anything or steal anything." "I know that too. So you got no call to send us anywhere," the boy said, and his voice carried the edge of someone who had rehearsed this argument many times over, who had anticipated exactly this confrontation and had prepared himself for it. "We ain't causing trouble. We're just—" He stopped. "Just what?" Samuel asked quietly. Ethan's arms dropped. Just slightly, just enough to betray how exhausted they were from holding the position, how much the bravery was costing him. "We're just trying to eat," the boy said. Samuel looked at the 4 of them for a long moment. The scarred, careful collection of scraps on their makeshift table. The worn-through soles of the younger boy's shoes. The way the oldest girl, Lily she'd been called, kept one arm firmly around the little one. Even now, even with Samuel standing still and speaking quietly, a habit so ingrained in her body that she probably didn't notice she was doing it. He turned around and walked back to the house. He heard Ethan's sharp intake of breath behind him, heard the boy whisper something fierce and quiet to his siblings, some instruction about being ready to run, and Samuel kept walking through the back door of the house and into his kitchen. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he built a fire in the stove. He heated the last of the morning's bread until it was warm all the way through. He sliced it and wrapped it in a clean cloth. He found the roasted chicken he'd been planning to eat for supper, most of it still good, and wrapped that too. He went out back and pulled 6 peaches from the tree that grew along the south fence, ripe ones, the kind that gave when you pressed them lightly. He filled a canteen with clean water. He carried all of it out and set it under the mesquite tree on the east side of the barn, not right where the children were not close enough to crowd them or corner them, but visible. Obvious. Unmistakable in its intention. Then he went back inside, turned the lamp low, and sat at his kitchen table. He didn't go back out to watch. He didn't stand at the window. He simply sat in the quiet of his house and listened, and after a while he heard the soft sound of children moving through the dark, careful, quick, the sound of small feet on dry ground, and then the settling quiet that meant they had found what he left and taken it somewhere safe. Samuel sat alone at his table for a long time that night. He couldn't have named what he was feeling. He hadn't practiced feeling things in so long that the experience was almost entirely foreign to him, like trying to read a language he'd once known as a boy and had spent 20 years forgetting. Something in his chest was different. Something had shifted. Some internal weight that had been sitting in one place for 19 years had moved just slightly, just enough to notice. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a plate of food under a mesquite tree was a simple act of human decency. The same thing any reasonable person would do, and it meant nothing beyond that. He believed this almost all the way to sleep. The next morning, Doss arrived at the usual hour and found Samuel already at the fence line with a post digger, and they worked through the morning without much talk, which was normal. Around mid-morning, Doss tilted his hat back and said without looking up from the wire he was stretching, "You know there's young'uns on the property." "I know," Samuel said. "Been there a few days, I'd reckon. Maybe more." "I know," Samuel said again. Doss was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you planning to do about it?" Samuel drove the post digger into the ground. "Nothing," he said. "For now." Doss nodded like this made complete sense, because Doss was a man who had learned that Samuel Walker's nothing often meant considerably more than it sounded. That afternoon, Samuel found a piece of paper tucked into the split of the fence post nearest the barn. Someone had drawn on it a rough crayon drawing the kind a young child makes, all color and instinct, and no particular discipline. And in the drawing, there was a tall, dark figure standing beside what was clearly meant to be a mesquite tree. And under the tree, there were 4 small figures, and around all of them, the child had drawn the sun in enormous yellow rays that took up most of the page. Below the drawing, in careful, slightly crooked letters, the handwriting of someone who was still learning but trying very hard, were 4 words. "Thank you, quiet cowboy." Samuel stood at the fence post holding that piece of paper for a long time. He folded it in half. He put it in the chest pocket of his work shirt. He went back to the fence line. That evening, he left food again. More this time, enough for several days. He included a blanket because the night before had been unseasonably cool, and he'd lain awake thinking about whether they had enough covering wherever they were sleeping. He included a small bottle of the liniment he kept for cuts and scrapes, and a bar of soap, and one of the old oil lamps he kept in the back of the storage room, with a tin of oil beside it. He didn't look to see if any of it was taken. He already knew it would be. What he didn't know, what he was still very carefully not allowing himself to think about, was the question of who these children belonged to, and why they were alone, and how long this arrangement was going to last before the rest of the world noticed and arrived with opinions about what ought to be done. In Harlan County, the rest of the world always arrived eventually. In Samuel Walker's long experience of the world, it rarely arrived with good intentions. He just didn't know yet how badly he was going to need to fight for these 4 children. He didn't know yet that fighting for them was going to cost him everything he'd ever built. And he didn't know, couldn't know, not yet, that the cost would be worth every single piece of it. But the paper was still in his chest pocket when he lay down that night. And for the first time in 19 years, Samuel Walker did not fall asleep feeling entirely alone. He found her on the 4th day, not by searching. Samuel Walker was not a man who went looking for trouble, and he had spent the better part of 3 mornings convincing himself that what he didn't know couldn't require anything of him. But the 4th morning broke differently. He was up before the light the way he always was, and he was crossing the yard to the water pump when he heard it. Not the children this time. Not the small, careful sounds of young feet trying not to be noticed, but something else entirely. A sound low and controlled, and deliberately quiet, the sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard crying. He stopped walking. The sound was coming from the abandoned equipment shed on the north side of the property, the one he'd meant to tear down 3 seasons ago and hadn't, because there was always something more urgent to do with his time and energy, and the shed wasn't hurting anything, just standing there with its rotting boards and its tilted roof and its general air of something that had been given up on. He stood still for a long moment. Then he walked toward the shed. He didn't announce himself. He didn't knock on the broken door that hung at an angle from one remaining hinge. He simply pushed it open slowly and stood in the doorway, and the woman inside spun around so fast she knocked over the small tin cup she'd been drinking from, and water spread across the dirt floor between them. She was younger than he'd expected. Mid-30s maybe. Though hard living had put something older behind her eyes. Dark hair pulled back tight, a plain gray dress that had been mended so many times the patches had hands that were raw at the knuckles from work. She put herself in front of the sleeping children. Immediately, all 4 of them curled together on a pile of blankets in the corner. The old blanket he'd left under the mesquite tree spread over the top of them, and she lifted her chin at him with an expression that Samuel recognized instantly because he had worn it himself more times than he could count. It was the face of someone who was terrified and absolutely refusing to show it. "Ma'am," he said. "I know we're on your land," she said. Her voice was controlled quiet, so as not to wake the children, but there was iron in it. "I know we have no right. I'm not going to pretend otherwise or make excuses for it." She swallowed. "But I am asking you as one human being to another to give me until the end of the week. I have written to my husband's brother in San Antonio, and I am expecting a reply. We will be gone before Sunday. I give you my word." Samuel looked at her. "How long have you been in this shed?" he asked. Something shifted in her face. Not weakness, not quite, but the particular strain of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and is being asked to describe its weight. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. The shed had no floor to speak of, just packed dirt. The roof had at least 2 places where daylight showed through. The summer nights in central Texas dropped to a temperature that felt merciful compared to the days, but was still no place for a 4-year-old child to sleep without proper shelter. 6 weeks, Samuel repeated. "We managed," she said, and the way she said it told him exactly how much managing it had taken, and how little she wanted his sympathy for any of it. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause. Then, "Sarah Brooks. My children are Ethan, Jacob, Lily, and Rose." "Mrs. Brooks," Samuel said. "My name is Samuel Walker. This is my ranch." He stopped, looked at the 4 sleeping children, looked back at her. "I left the food," he said. Her composure nearly broke then. It didn't, she was too practiced at not letting things break, but he saw it, the way her jaw shifted and her eyes went briefly bright before she pulled them back under control. "I know," she said. I told the children not to take it. Ethan didn't listen." The faintest trace of something that wasn't quite a smile. "He rarely does." "Good," Samuel said. "He was right not to." She studied him for a moment, measuring something. "You're not going to make us leave?" she asked. "Not today," he said. He left before she could respond because he had reached the end of what he knew how to say, and he was not a man who spoke past that point. He went back to the house. He made a full breakfast, more than he'd made for himself in years, more than he could have justified eating alone, and he carried it to the shed on a proper tray with a cloth over it to keep the heat in, and he set it on the crate outside the shed door and walked away without waiting to see what she did with it. He heard the door open behind him. He heard her voice, quiet and careful. "Mr. Walker." He stopped, but didn't turn around. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and kept walking. That was how it started. Not with grand declarations or dramatic moments, with a breakfast tray and a woman too proud to break down, and a man too unused to softness to know what to do with what he was feeling. He started leaving supplies in a more organized way after that. Not just food, but things a family actually needed. Candles. A proper lamp. More blankets. He found an old cot in the storage room and dragged it to the shed without telling her he was going to, and when he came back in the evening, it had been moved inside, and she had left a folded piece of paper on the crate where he'd taken to setting things. He opened it. It was a list written in the most careful, precise schoolteacher's handwriting he had ever seen of everything she had taken from him, with a column beside each item, labeled "What I will repay when I am able." Every item. Even the ones he'd thrown away that the children had taken before he started leaving things deliberately. He stood there in the fading light reading that list for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in his chest pocket beside the drawing Ethan had left him, and he went inside. He was not prepared on the following morning for what the town already knew. He rode into Harlan for supplies on a Wednesday, and Calloway met him at the counter with a look that told Samuel something had already been said before he walked through the door. 3 other men were positioned at various points in the store, with the studied casualness of people who had been waiting for him to arrive. "Morning, Walker," Calloway said. "Here you've got some folks camping out on your north acreage." Samuel set his list on the counter. "I'll need everything on that. Woman and 4 young'uns from what I understand." "The flour first if you've got it," Samuel said. Calloway leaned forward slightly. "That woman's husband died owing debts all over this county, Samuel. There are men who have legitimate claims against whatever she's got left. You taking her in creates complications." One of the other men, Garrett Holt, who owned the feed store and had the disposition of someone who had never once in his life gone hungry, pushed off from the wall he'd been leaning against. "It ain't just about debts," Holt said. "You've got a single woman living on your property with 4 children and no husband. People are going to talk. They already are talking." Samuel looked at Holt. "Then they've got more time than sense," Samuel said. "Those kids might be better off separated," said the third man, and Samuel couldn't remember his name but recognized the type immediately, the kind of man who used words like "better off" when he meant more convenient. County could place them with proper families, give them a real start. Something went very still in Samuel Walker. "Say that again," Samuel said quietly. The man blinked. "I'm only saying the children could be—" "Those children," Samuel said, his voice dropping lower than conversation, "are exactly where they need to be. And I'll tell you something plainly, so there's no room for misunderstanding later." He picked up his list from the counter. "I own 340 acres in this county. I pay my taxes and I pay them on time. I have never in 30 years asked this town for a single thing." He let that sit for a moment. "As long as I own that land, nobody, not you, not the county, not anyone else with more opinions than business is moving those children anywhere. We clear." The store was very quiet. Calloway cleared his throat. "I'll get your flour," he said. Samuel rode back to the ranch with the wagon loaded and the knowledge sitting heavy in his gut that the conversation in Calloway's store would be repeated in every parlor and supper table in Harlan County before the week was out. He'd made a declaration in public, which meant it was binding in ways that went beyond his own intentions. He'd put himself between that family and the town was going to push back, and he was going to have to hold the line. He hadn't entirely decided to do this before he walked into that store. He decided it in the moment Holt said the word "separated." He pulled the wagon around to the shed and was unloading the supplies when Ethan appeared from nowhere, the way the boy always seemed to soundless and sudden, as if he materialized out of the air whenever Samuel was working, and without a word picked up a sack of cornmeal nearly as big as his torso and started carrying it toward the shed. "You don't have to do that," Samuel said. "I know," Ethan said, and kept carrying. They worked in silence for a few minutes, Samuel handing things down from the wagon, Ethan ferrying them inside with a seriousness that made him seem 40 years old. And then Samuel said without planning to, "Anybody in town been bothering your mother?" Ethan set down a crate of canned goods and looked up at him. Those old eyes in that young face. "Mr. Patterson tried to talk to her outside the church last week," he said. "Told her she needed to make arrangements for us. Said he knew families that would take us in." "What did she say?" Ethan picked up the crate again. "She told him that her children weren't arrangements to be made, and that she'd die before she let anyone separate us." He paused at the shed door. Then she smiled at him like everything was perfectly fine and walked away. Samuel looked at the shed door for a moment after the boy went inside. He picked up the next crate, I thought about a woman who had been living in an equipment shed for 6 weeks, who kept precise accounts of everything she'd been given so she could pay it back. Who told a man trying to separate her family that she'd die first, and then smiled. He didn't know what to make of Sarah Brooks. He knew he was starting to want to. Sarah herself appeared that evening when he was checking the water supply line near the shed, appeared the way she tended to without warning, as if she'd been waiting for a moment when he couldn't easily walk away from a conversation. "Ethan told me what you said in town," she said. Samuel kept his attention on the water line. "Did he? He tells me most things," she said. "Usually things I didn't ask him to report on." She paused. "What you said about nobody moving the children. You didn't have to do that." "No," Samuel agreed. "You've already done more than anyone had any right to expect of you." He looked up at her then. She was watching him with that careful, measuring expression she seemed to wear whenever she was trying to figure out where he actually stood, as if his position might shift without warning, and she needed to be ready. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "I've lived on this land my whole life. I've watched this county judge people for things that were none of their business and call it community concern. I've watched families get broken apart for the convenience of people who didn't have to live with the consequences." He looked back at the waterline. "I'm not interested in being another person who looks the other way." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't know us," she said. "Not an accusation, an observation. You know almost nothing about us." "I know Ethan carried a sack of cornmeal bigger than he was without being asked," Samuel said. "I know your youngest follows me around the yard like she's taking notes. I know Lily sings when she thinks nobody's listening." He paused. "And I know Jacob has been watching me fix that water line for 3 days from behind the shed corner, and one of these mornings I'm going to hand him a wrench and let him help, if that's agreeable to you." Something happened in Sarah Brooks' face that she couldn't entirely control. It wasn't quite crying. It wasn't quite smiling. It was something between the two, something private and involuntary that she pressed her lips together to contain. "That would be agreeable," she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "He loved to help his father with things. He's been—" She stopped. "He needs that." Samuel nodded. He stood up, wiping his hands on his work cloth, and he was about to say something practical about the water line, when little Rose, 4 years old, braids already coming undone. By mid-morning, completely unconcerned with the concept of appropriate timing, pushed through the shed door, crossed the distance between them at a determined trot, and attached herself firmly to Samuel's left leg. "Cowboy," she announced, looking up at him with absolute confidence. "Rose," Sarah said, in the tone of a woman who has said a particular child's name in a particular tone, approximately 10,000 times. "Let go of Mr. Walker's leg." Rose considered this instruction seriously. Then she tightened her grip. "She's all right," Samuel said. He looked down at the small person attached to his leg, who was looking back up at him like he was something she'd decided to keep. And for a moment, just a moment, Samuel Walker felt something so foreign and so enormous that he couldn't name it, couldn't contain it, couldn't manage it the way he managed everything else in his life. He reached down and carefully, awkwardly set his large, scarred hand on top of her head. Rose beamed. Sarah watched this with the expression of someone witnessing something they hadn't believed they would see again. The next morning, the town made its first real move. 3 men rode out to the ranch before breakfast. Holt from the field, Patterson from the church, and a man named Croft, who handled county administrative matters and had the look of someone who had arrived with paperwork and a prepared speech. Samuel met them in the yard before they could get close to the shed. "Walker," Croft said, "we've had some concern raised about the situation here, formally." "Is that so?" Samuel said. "The woman is a widow with no legal claim to this property and no means of support. The children are potentially at risk. The county has procedures." "She's a guest on my property," Samuel said. "I invited her." Croft blinked. "I wasn't aware." "I'm making you aware now," Samuel said. "She and her children are here at my invitation, which makes this a private matter on private land. You got paperwork that says otherwise, you go get a judge to sign off on it and come back. Until then, you're standing on my property without an invitation, and I'd ask you to correct that." The 3 men looked at each other. Holt said, This isn't over, Samuel. I didn't imagine it was, Samuel said pleasantly. Safe ride back to town. He stood in the yard and watched them go. Behind him, from the direction of the shed, he heard a sound he hadn't expected. A small, quiet sound that he needed a moment to identify because it had been so many years since he'd been close enough to a child to hear it. It was Rose laughing. She was standing in the shed doorway, watching the men ride away, and she was laughing the way 4-year-olds laugh when something delights them for reasons they couldn't explain if asked purely completely, without reservation. Samuel turned around. Rose pointed at the retreating horses and looked at him with eyes full of absolute certainty. "They going away," she said. "They are," Samuel said. "Good," said Rose with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict, and Samuel Walker, who had not smiled in longer than he could accurately remember, felt the corners of his mouth move in a direction that surprised him entirely. He didn't stop it. For the first time in 19 years, he didn't stop it. The smile didn't last long. 3 days after Croft and his men rode away from the ranch. Samuel was in town picking up wire when he heard it. Not directed at him, not meant for his ears. The particular kind of conversation that happens in the gap between two buildings when people believe they're alone. Holt's voice low and certain, talking to Patterson about a letter that had already been sent. Not to the county this time, to the state. Samuel kept walking. I didn't let on that he'd heard. He finished his business at the hardware store, loaded the wire into the wagon, and rode back to the ranch with his jaw set and his mind working through what that letter likely said, and who it was likely addressed to, and how much time he probably had before, whatever it set in motion, arrived on his doorstep. The answer, by his best calculation, was not much. He found Sarah at the water pump, washing out a shirt that belonged to Jacob. The boy had gotten into something tar-based along the fence line that morning, following Samuel, the way he'd taken to doing handing tools, and watching everything with those quiet, hungry eyes that reminded Samuel of himself at that age, in ways that made his chest ache. She wrung out the shirt without looking up when she heard his boots on the dry ground. "You've got something on your mind," she said. "Always do," Samuel said. "This is different." She looked up then. Whatever she saw in his face made her set the shirt down on the pump handle and give him her full attention. "What happened in town?" he told her. "All of it." Holt's voice in the gap between buildings, the letter his best guess at what it meant and how long they had. He told it straight without softening any of it, because he had learned in the past 3 weeks that Sarah Brooks did not want things softened. She wanted the truth delivered at full weight so she could figure out what to do with it, and he respected that more than he knew how to say. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "How serious is it?" "Serious enough," Samuel said. "A state-level inquiry into the welfare of children on private property. They'll send someone. Could be a marshal, could be a welfare officer if the county's got one, which I'm not certain it does. Either way, when they come, they'll have authority I can't simply ask to leave." "When?" she said. "Not if. When." "When," he confirmed. Sarah picked up the shirt again, wrung out a section that didn't need wringing, and stared at the water running off her hands. "I should take the children and go," she said. "Before it gets worse. Before it brings more trouble down on you." "No," Samuel said. She looked at him. "Running doesn't fix it," he said. "Running just means they've won without having to do the work, and the next place you go, there'll be another Holt and another Patterson and another letter. You run now, you'll be running forever." He held her gaze. "I've got a lawyer in Austin I've done land business with for 15 years. Man named Hargrove. I'm going to write him tonight, and I'm going to ask him what legal ground we're standing on and what we can do to make it solid." Sarah was very still. "You'd do that," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Already decided it," Samuel said. "Just telling you so you know." Something moved through her face, that complicated thing she did when emotion got close to the surface, and she managed it rather than let it run. She turned back to the pump and resumed her work, but her hands had changed. They were steadier than they'd been a moment before. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Samuel," he said. He wasn't entirely sure why he said it. He'd been Mr. Walker his entire adult life, and he'd never once asked anyone to change that. She paused. "Samuel," she said, and the words sat differently in the air than anything else she'd said to him. "Whatever Hargrove tells you, whatever this costs, I need you to know that I will pay back every penny of it, every cent. It may take years. It will take years, but I will." "I know you will," he said. "That's not why I'm doing it." He walked back toward the house before she could ask him why he was doing it, because he wasn't entirely certain he had an answer that would make sense to either of them. The letter to Hargrove went out the next morning on the early mail. Samuel wrote it at the kitchen table before sunrise by lamplight, choosing his words carefully, the way he chose everything without waste, without decoration, with exactly the weight required, and no more. He laid out the facts. He asked the right questions. He sealed it and handed it to the mail rider at the road, and then went back to work, because the work was always there, and it was the one thing he knew how to do without doubt. What he did not expect was what happened that afternoon. Ethan came to find him at the south pasture, running, which was unusual, because Ethan was not a boy who ran unless the situation required it, and arrived at the fence line slightly breathless with something in his hand. "Letter came for Mama," he said. "From San Antonio." Samuel went still. He had nearly forgotten about the letter Sarah had mentioned that first morning in the shed, the one she'd written to her husband's brother before she'd known that Samuel knew they were there, the one she'd been expecting a reply to. "She already read it?" he asked. Ethan nodded. His expression was hard to read. The boy had inherited his mother's talent for keeping his face arranged, but he was 9 years old, and 9 has limits. "She's in the shed," he said. "She's not crying, but she's doing the thing she does when she's trying not to." Samuel left the fence. He knocked on the shed doorframe. The door still hung at its angle. They'd adapted to it, and Sarah said, "Come in," without looking up from the letter in her hands. She was sitting on the cot, the paper held flat across her knee, and she had the composed, deliberate stillness of a woman who had already made some decision and was working out the details of living with it. "The brother," she said. "Daniel." She smoothed the edge of the letter with her thumb. He says he's sorry for our trouble. He says he's praying for us." A pause. "He also says he has 4 children of his own and a 5th on the way, and that he regrets he's not in a position to take on additional family at this time." Samuel said nothing. "He wished us well," Sarah said, "very sincerely." She folded the letter with precise, careful movements. "So that's that." "Sarah, I'm all right," she said. Her voice was absolutely level. I wasn't certain he would say yes. I was hoping, but I wasn't certain." She set the folded letter on the blanket beside her. "I just need a minute to rearrange some things in my head, and then I'll be fine." Samuel sat down on the crate across from her without asking permission. She looked at him, slightly surprised by this. He had never sat down in the shed before, had always conducted any conversation from the doorway with one foot essentially still outside. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Samuel, I mean it. You and the children are staying on this property for as long as you need to. That's not negotiation, and it's not charity. It's just a fact I'm telling you." He held her gaze. "Hargrove will tell us how to make it legal and airtight, and whatever he says to do, we'll do it. But I need you to stop looking for a door out of this situation. Stop trying to find a way to make this somebody else's problem to solve." She stared at him for a moment. "Why?" she asked. And the way she asked it was not defiant. It was genuinely puzzled, the question of someone who had been let down enough times that they'd stopped trusting kindness at face value. "Why does it matter to you? You didn't know us 6 weeks ago. You didn't owe us anything then, and you don't owe us anything now. So why?" Samuel thought about this. He turned the question over the way he turned a problem over seriously, without rushing, giving it the weight it deserved. "Because Ethan stood between me and his sisters," he said finally, with nothing but his own 2 arms and the decision that he was not going to let anything happen to them. "And I recognized something in that." He paused. "I recognized it because I used to know how to do that. Stand between something I cared about and whatever was coming for it." He looked at his hands. "I forgot how for a long time. I think I'd like to remember." The shed was very quiet. Outside, they could hear Rose talking to the cat that had appeared from somewhere along the fence line 3 days ago, and had immediately adopted the children as its permanent responsibility. Lily's voice slightly older, answering her sister in the patient tone of someone who had been answering Rose's questions since before she could properly walk. Jacob somewhere further off, making the sound of a boy trying to be very quiet about something he was doing. You had someone, Sarah said. Not a question. Before. Someone you stood between and the world. Samuel nodded. What happened? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'll tell you that story someday, he said. Not today. Today I need you to trust me enough to stop planning your exit and let me deal with Holt and Patterson and whoever they've written to in Austin. She looked at him for another long measuring moment. Then she nodded. One small, deliberate nod. All right, she said. But I'm not going to stop keeping accounts of what you've given us. I know, Samuel said. I'd expect nothing less. He stood up and was at the door when she said his name, said Samuel, the way she had at the pump with that particular weight. He turned. Thank you, she said. Not for the supplies, not for the lawyer, for, she stopped, looked for the word, for sitting down. He understood what she meant, and he nodded, and he went back to the fence line. The reply from Hargrove arrived 11 days later, and it was not simple reading. Samuel went through it 3 times at the kitchen table, tracing the logic of it carefully. And then he rode into town to the telegraph office and sent 2 messages. One back to Hargrove with follow-up questions. One to a county records clerk he'd done business with in Austin, whose name Hargrove had provided. He was back at the ranch by mid-afternoon, and he went directly to find Sarah. There's a legal mechanism, he told her, standing in the yard outside the shed with Jacob hovering at the edge of his peripheral vision, the way the boy always did when something important seemed to be happening. It's called a formal residency arrangement. Hargrove says if I document your presence here as an established working arrangement, if we set it up properly with your labor contributing to the ranch operation, in a documented way, it creates a legal basis that's much harder to challenge than simple charity. Sarah's eyes sharpened. What would that look like? You taught school, he said. Before. 7 years, she said. Why? Doss's wife has been trying to get a lending library started in town for 2 years. Woman named Abigail Turner has been pushing the same thing from the church side. Neither of them has anybody with the background to organize it or run it, and neither of them has the books. He paused. I've got about 400 books in the house that haven't been opened in 15 years. My mother's collection. Sarah stared at him. If you were running a legitimate community lending library operating out of this ranch, Samuel said carefully. That's a community contribution. That's documented civic purpose. It changes the nature of what you're doing here from trespassing to service, and it gives Hargrove something to work with legally. The silence stretched. 400 books, Sarah said. Give or take. I haven't counted recently. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. She was working through it. He could see her doing the mental architecture of it, testing the structure from different angles, the way she did with every important thing. Then something shifted in her face. Something that was for the first time in his presence close to hope. Real hope, not the managed, rationed, careful kind she'd been allowing herself in small doses, but the larger, more dangerous kind. The children could help, she said. Ethan can catalog. Lily has been practicing her letters every day she could. She stopped. I'm getting ahead of myself. No, Samuel said. Get ahead. Plan ahead. That's what we need. She looked at him for a moment. Then, when can I see the books? He led her to the house for the first time. Through the back door, through the kitchen, where she glanced at everything quickly and cataloged it. The way she cataloged everything down the hallway to the front room, where the shelves covered 2 full walls, floor to ceiling. His mother's careful collection, accumulated over 30 years, organized by subject in her neat hand. Sarah stopped in the doorway. She didn't speak for a moment. My word, she said softly. Take whatever you need, Samuel said. Take all of it if it's useful. She turned to look at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Completely unguarded. The careful management gone for just a moment. Something open and real and unprotected in its place. Then the front door crashed open. Ethan. breathless, white-faced, nothing at all like his usual controlled self. "There's a man at the gate," the boy said. "He's got a badge." Samuel moved past him, immediately out the front door and down the porch steps, and he was halfway across the yard before he heard Sarah behind him. She'd followed closer than he expected, and Ethan was right at her shoulder. The man at the gate was younger than Samuel had expected, maybe 30, with a federal marshal's badge, and the look of someone who was trying to project more authority than he entirely felt. He had a document in his hand. "Samuel Walker," he said. "That's right," Samuel said. "Marshal Aldous Webb out of Austin. I've got a welfare inquiry document here regarding children reported to be living on this property in conditions of—" "Let me see that," Samuel said. Webb blinked. "Mr. Walker, I need to. I'd like to read what I'm being presented with before anyone continues speaking," Samuel said and held out his hand. Webb, after a pause, handed it over. Samuel read it. Slowly. Thoroughly. Webb shifted his weight. Behind Samuel, he could hear Sarah standing completely still. The particular still she got when she was holding something in very tightly. He finished reading. He handed the document back. "Marshal Webb," he said. "Those children are the family of my formerly employed household staff living on this property at my explicit invitation and contributing to a documented community service operation. I have legal counsel in Austin man named Hargrove. You may know his firm, who has been advising this arrangement for 3 weeks. I'd suggest you telegraph Hargrove's office before you take any further action, because whatever that document says, the legal ground you're standing on is considerably less solid than whoever wrote it believed." Webb looked at the document, looked at Samuel, looked at Sarah. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you here of your own free will?" "I am," Sarah said. "And your children are safe," she said. "Fed, sheltered, learning." A pause. "More than I can say for where we were 6 months ago." Webb looked at Samuel again. Something in his young face was working through a calculation. "I'll telegraph Austin," he said. "If your lawyer's story checks out, Mr. Walker, I won't have cause to proceed further." "That's all I'm asking," Samuel said. Webb tipped his hat to Sarah specifically, which Samuel noticed, and rode back toward town. Samuel stood at the gate until the dust settled. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the ordinary quiet of the ranch yard. A low, distant sound. A deep rolling that had nothing to do with thunder because the sky directly overhead was clear. He turned instinctively, scanning the horizon, and he saw it in the northeast, a column of smoke dark and heavy and moving fast, lit orange at its base, where it met the dry hills. His whole body went cold. "Samuel!" Sarah's voice very controlled, which meant she'd seen it too. "Get the children," he said. "Get them now. Everything you can carry in your arms. Move." She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She turned and ran toward the shed, calling the children's names, and Samuel ran for the barn, where Doss kept the water barrels and the beating sacks and the things you needed when fire crossed dry Texas hills in the wrong direction at the end of the driest summer in a decade. The wind shifted. He felt it on his face, felt it change direction with the sudden indifferent certainty of weather, and he understood immediately that what had been moving away from them was now moving toward them instead. He started running faster. The fire moved. The way fire always moves in central Texas at the end of a dry summer, without mercy and without hesitation, feeding on everything the drought had prepared for it. Samuel had the water barrels on the wagon in 4 minutes. He knew because he counted. Counting was the thing his mind did when panic tried to get in, a habit built over 30 years of emergencies that required clear heads and fast hands. 4 minutes for the barrels, 2 more for the beating sacks and the long-handled shovels. He was hitching the second horse when Doss appeared from the direction of the east pasture at a dead run, which Samuel had never once seen the man do in 11 years. "Northeast fence line's already gone," Doss said, not breaking stride, swinging up onto the wagon seat beside Samuel. "Wind's pushing it southwest. If it hits the dry creek bed, it'll jump, and we won't be able to stop it." "How long?" Samuel said. 20 minutes, maybe less." Samuel looked toward the shed. Sarah had all 4 children out, Rose on her hip. Jacob and Lily pressed close on either side. Ethan slightly ahead of the group, the way he always positioned himself, scanning the smoke with the face of someone calculating distances. Samuel drove the wagon toward them. "Get in the back," he told Sarah. "All of you." "Where are we going?" Ethan asked. "Colton's place, 2 miles east. The fire's moving southwest, so east is safe. Get in, son." Ethan got in. He helped his brother and sisters in after him, then held out his hand for his mother. Sarah passed Rose up first, then took Ethan's hand and climbed in. She settled Rose between herself and Lily, wrapped one arm around Jacob, and looked at Samuel. "Go," she said. He drove. He got them 1.5 miles out before Ethan made a sound behind him. Not a word. Just a sharp intake of breath that cut through the noise of the wagon and the wind and the distant roar of the fire. Samuel glanced back. The boy's face had gone the color of ash. "The box," Ethan said. His voice was strange, hollow. "Mama, the box." Sarah turned to look at him. Something passed across her face. "Ethan." "I left it," the boy said. "I left it in the shed. Mama, I left Papa's picture." The photograph. Samuel knew about it. Sarah had mentioned it once in passing, the way people mention the things that matter most when they're trying to speak casually about them. The only photograph of Thomas Brooks. Taken the year before he died, the only one they had. The one Ethan had carried from their house in a tin box the day the bank came and taken everything else. "It's all right," Sarah said, and the effort it cost her to say it steadily was visible. "It's all right, sweetheart. It's just a picture." "It's not just a picture," Ethan said. He wasn't crying. His voice was harder than that. "It's the only one. It's the only thing we have left of him." "Ethan." "I'll go back," the boy said, and started to stand up in the moving wagon. Samuel pulled the horses to a stop. Everyone looked at him. He handed the reins to Doss without a word. "Samuel." Sarah's voice. Sharp, immediate, with something in it he'd never heard from her before, something close to fear, the real kind, not the managed kind. "Samuel, don't." He was already down from the wagon. "Keep driving east," he told Doss. "Don't stop until you reach Colton's. I'll follow on foot when I can." "The fire," Doss started. "I know where the fire is," Samuel said. "Drive." "Samuel." Sarah's voice again, different now, lower. He turned to look at her and found her eyes on him, not with the measured, careful expression she usually wore, but with something open and direct and frightened, in a way that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with him specifically. "Please don't," she said. He held her gaze for a second. "Take care of them," he said. He turned and ran back toward the ranch. He heard the wagon moving behind him. He heard Rose crying, the sudden alarmed cry of a small child who understood that something was wrong without knowing exactly what. He heard Ethan's voice, tight and wrecked, calling after him. He put all of it behind him and ran. The smoke was already thick when he hit the ranch yard. His eyes were streaming before he reached the shed. The fire hadn't jumped the creek bed yet. Doss had been right about the timing, barely, but he could feel the heat of it from 50 yards away, a physical pressure against his face and chest, like a door being pushed against him from the other side. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth and went into the shed. The tin box was exactly where Ethan had described it. Under the cot, pushed against the wall, a small dented thing with a wire latchlight, as almost nothing when he grabbed it. He was back out of the shed in under a minute, the box in his hand. Then the wind shifted again. He heard it before he felt it. A change in the roar of the fire, a deepening, a surge, and then the heat hit him from a completely different direction, and he understood that the creek bed had gone. The fire had jumped. What had been a threat from the northeast was now a presence on 3 sides, and the path he'd run in on was already lost in smoke so thick he couldn't see 10 feet ahead. He moved on instinct. He knew this land the way he knew his own hands, every fence line, every ditch, every dry wash and slight rise. He moved through the smoke by memory, by feel, by the 30 years of his feet, knowing this ground. He went down into the shallow gully behind the barn, where the dirt was damper, and the grass had never grown in properly dropped flat, when a wall of heat rolled over him, pressed his face against his arm, and waited 4 seconds, then pushed up and kept moving. He came through the fire line on the south side. He didn't know how. He was never entirely certain afterward. There were gaps in the next few minutes, places where the sequence of events blurred at the edges. He knew his left arm was burned. He knew the box was still in his right hand. He knew he was on the ground at some point, and then he was not on the ground, and then there was open air and the sound of someone shouting his name. Doss. Doss had come back. The older man grabbed him by the good arm and pulled him upright, and they half ran, half stumbled away from the fire line until they were far enough out that the air was mostly breathable again, and Samuel stopped and put his hands on his knees and coughed for a long time. "You got it," Doss said, looking at the tin box. "I got it," Samuel said. Doss looked at Samuel's left arm, looked at his face. "You look terrible," he said. "Feel it too," Samuel said, and straightened up. The Colton farm was another half-mile. They walked it. Samuel held the tin box in his right hand the whole way, and did not think about his left arm, because thinking about it would not improve it, and there were more important things to do with his attention. He heard Rose before he saw them. The little girl came running across the Colton yard the moment she spotted him. Not with the careful, deliberate trot she usually employed, but at full 4-year-old velocity arms. Out completely committed, and she hit him at knee height and wrapped herself around his legs and said his name the way she always said it, that single declarative word, cowboy. He reached down and picked her up with his right arm, the tin box pressed between them. She buried her face in his neck and held on. Over her head, he saw Sarah. She was standing 20 feet away, and she had stopped walking when he picked Rose up, and she was looking at him with an expression that she was making no effort whatsoever to manage or contain, something raw and real and entirely unguarded on her face. Something that the careful, composed woman he'd come to know over these weeks had never once let him see before. She crossed the distance between them. She stopped in front of him and looked at his arm, and her jaw tightened, and then she looked at his face, and then she looked at the tin box. "You went back for it," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He held the box out to her. She took it with both hands, held it, pressed it flat against her chest for a moment with her eyes closed. Behind her, Ethan was watching from the porch of the Colton house with Jacob beside him. The boy's face, when Samuel looked at him, had gone entirely through something, gone through and come out the other side of it. Some profound private reckoning that had happened behind those serious eyes in the time it took Samuel to run to the ranch and come back. Ethan walked down the porch steps. He crossed the yard. He stopped in front of Samuel with the box now back in his mother's hands, and he looked up at him, and for a moment, the boy with the old eyes and the wide arms and the voice that didn't shake was simply 9 years old. Simply a child who had been carrying too much for too long, and had just watched a man run into fire to save the last thing he had of his father. "Thank you," Ethan said. His voice broke on the second word. Just slightly. Just enough. Samuel put his right hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's what family does," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out of him the way true things sometimes come, not from thinking, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere below thought. Some place in him that had been gradually filling up over the past weeks without his full awareness, and had finally reached the point of spilling over. Ethan stared at him. Then the boy did something Samuel had not expected, stepped forward and pressed his forehead against Samuel's chest, and Samuel wrapped his right arm around him and held on, and neither of them said anything else. The fire burned for 2 more days. When it was over, Samuel rode back to the ranch with Doss to take stock of the damage. The shed was gone entirely. The north fence line needed complete replacement. The barn had caught at one corner, but Doss and 2 of the Colton boys had beaten it out before it spread. The house was intact. The mesquite tree, the one Samuel had left food under that first night, was scorched along one side, but still standing. He stood in the yard and looked at it. He thought about a 9-year-old boy with his arms spread wide. He thought about a woman who kept accounts so she could pay back every cent. He thought about what he had said to Ethan without planning to, and whether or not he had meant it, and realized the question answered itself immediately. He had meant every syllable of it, had meant it more completely than he'd meant almost anything he could remember saying in the last 20 years. The news of what he'd done traveled fast. It traveled the way news travels in small counties imperfectly with embellishment, but with the essential truth intact. Samuel Walker had run back into a fire on the wrong side of a jumped creek bed to save a dead man's photograph for 4 children who weren't his. By the time he rode into Harlan 2 days after the fire to speak with Hargrove's associate about the legal paperwork, the shape of the story had already done something to the atmosphere of the town that Samuel hadn't anticipated. Abigail Turner stopped him on the street. She was a small, direct woman in her 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to organizing other people and the grace to do it without making them feel organized. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I want to help, whatever that family needs. Tell me what they need." "They need a place to stay while the shed gets rebuilt," Samuel said, then stopped, reconsidered. "Actually, they're staying in the house. I moved them into the house 2 days ago." Abigail blinked. "Oh," she said. Then with a very small smile, "Well, then I suppose they need everything else. Furniture, proper bedding, clothing for the children, books for the library. Mrs. Brooks is going to run." "You heard about that," Samuel said. "I helped come up with it," Abigail said. "Hargrove's associate is a friend of my husband's. Samuel, half this town wants to help and doesn't know how. Let me organize them. That's what I'm good at." I thought about this for a moment. "Tell them to start with the fence line," he said. "I've got posts, but I'm short on wire, and I could use hands." She nodded and was already moving. What happened over the following week was something Samuel would not have predicted if he'd been asked to forecast it. It arrived without announcement, and without his asking men showing up at the ranch with tools and wire and working the fence line from first light. Women coming with food and bedding and clothing for the children. The church sent lumber. The hardware store sent supplies at cost. Even Calloway, who had looked at Samuel with that complicit expression. The morning Holt and Patterson were there, came out with his 2 sons, and worked a full day on the barn corner without saying much, except that he was sorry he hadn't said something sooner. Samuel accepted all of it without ceremony, because these were people doing what they should have done to begin with, and the right response to that was acknowledgement, not absolution. He let them work. He worked alongside them. He noticed that the men who came were, without exception, men who had kept quiet when others spoke, not the Holts and the Pattersons, but the ones who'd stood in the background with their mouths closed and their consciences apparently active. Sarah ran the house with the same focused competence she brought to everything. She organized the meals that the women brought, made sure the children were helpful, and not underfoot kept Lily from reorganizing the book collection according to her own system, which differed significantly from the original. She had moved the 400 books from the front room to the larger back room off the kitchen and begun cataloging them with Ethan in the evenings, and Samuel, passing the doorway, had watched the 2 of them bent over a handwritten ledger with the oil lamp between them, working with the comfortable concentration of people who were doing exactly what they were suited for. It was on the 5th evening after the fire that Hargrove's associate arrived in person. His name was Merritt, and he was a lean, precise man in a town suit who looked out of place on a cattle ranch, but had the practical, unsentimental manner of someone who spent his professional life cutting through complications. He sat across from Samuel and Sarah at the kitchen table. The children had been sent outside, which Ethan complied with only after giving Samuel a look that communicated clearly that he knew he was being managed, and he spread 3 documents on the table. "The welfare inquiry has been dropped," he said. Webb filed a report recommending closure after his visit. Apparently, what he observed here did not match the description in the original complaint, and he said so in writing. Samuel said nothing. Sarah said nothing. "The legal arrangement for the library operation is solid," Merritt continued. "As documented, Mrs. Brooks functions as a staff member of the Walker Ranch with documented community service responsibilities. That's airtight." He paused, picked up the 3rd document. "There's a 3rd matter. Hargrove asked me to discuss it with you in person because he felt it was the kind of thing that required a human conversation rather than a letter." He set the document on the table between them. Samuel looked at it, looked at Merritt. It came to Hargrove's attention during the process of establishing the residency documentation. Merritt said carefully, "that there is an existing legal record relating to you, Mr. Walker, from approximately 20 years ago, regarding a land contract." Something went still in Samuel's face. "The woman's name," Merritt said quietly, was Clara Voss. She signed a land contract with you in 1864, which you honored in full. She subsequently provided testimony in a county property dispute that characterized the arrangement as having been made under your misrepresentation. That testimony was false. Hargrove's research has established that clearly. The kitchen was very quiet. Sarah was looking at Samuel. I was not looking at anything in particular. His face had the expression of a man who has just been told that a wound he thought was his fault was not his fault, which is not always a simple thing to receive, because the ownership of that wound has become part of the structure of who you are, and having it taken away means something in that structure has to shift. She lied, Samuel said. His voice was flat. Deliberately, and for financial advantage, Merritt said. The record is clear. I believed her, Samuel said. For 20 years I believed her account of what happened. I know, Merritt said. He gave that a moment of proper space. Hargrove wanted you to know that you have legal remedy available if you choose to pursue it. The record can be formally corrected. The false testimony can be struck. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Sarah had not moved. She was watching his face with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered, not trying to fill the silence just present in it with him. Strike the record, Samuel said finally. I don't need the remedy, I just need the record corrected. Merritt nodded, made a note. Mr. Walker, he said, and something in his professional manner warmed slightly. For what it's worth, Hargrove has known you for 15 years. He asked me to tell you that he's glad this came to light. After Merritt left, Samuel and Sarah sat at the kitchen table without speaking for a few minutes. Outside they could hear the children. Rose narrating something elaborate to the cat Lily's music from around the corner of the house, Jacob and Ethan in what appeared to be a debate about fence post spacing that had gotten surprisingly intense. 20 years, Sarah said finally. 20 years, Samuel said. She looked at her hands on the table, then back at him. You've been carrying that for 20 years, and it wasn't yours to carry. He didn't say anything. Samuel, she said. And then, I'm sorry. Not for the practical matter of it, for the years, for what it cost you. She held his gaze. You deserved better than that. Whatever anyone told you about yourself as a result of what that woman did, it wasn't true. He looked at her for a long moment. I know that now, he said, and the strange, enormous thing was that he meant it not as an aspiration, not as something he was working toward, but as a present, actual fact, settling into him with the solidity of something that was going to stay. Ethan appeared in this kitchen doorway. He read the room with the accuracy of someone who had been reading rooms out of necessity his entire life, and he said, Is everything all right? Everything's all right, Samuel said. The boy nodded, leaned in the doorway for a moment. Then, Rose wants to know if you're going to have supper with us tonight, or if you're going to eat alone in the kitchen again. Samuel looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Samuel. Tell her I'll be there, Samuel said. Ethan's face did something quick and controlled and not quite hidden, and he disappeared back out the door. Samuel stood up from the table. For the first time in 20 years, the weight he'd been carrying was not in the room with him. He went to have supper with his family. Supper that first night was not a quiet affair. It could not have been quiet, even if everyone at the table had been trying, which none of the children were. Rose had positioned herself in the chair directly beside Samuel before anyone else could sit down with the focused territorial efficiency of someone who had identified the best seat in the room and secured it. Jacob wanted to know if Samuel had ever been in a real gunfight. Lily corrected Jacob for asking, then asked the same question herself in more polished language. Ethan said nothing, but he watched Samuel the way he always watched him, seriously, carefully storing things. Sarah passed cornbread and caught Samuel's eye across the table. He didn't know what his face was doing. He suspected it was doing something he would have been embarrassed by a month ago. He found that he couldn't bring himself to stop it. After supper, after the children were settled and the kitchen was clean, Sarah came to the front porch, where Samuel had taken to sitting in the evenings with a cup of coffee he rarely finished. She sat in the other chair without asking, which she had not done before, had always waited to be invited, had always kept that precise, careful distance. She sat down and looked out at the dark yard without saying anything for a while, and Samuel let the silence be what it was, which was not uncomfortable in the least. "How long has it been since this house had people in it?" she asked finally. 19 years, Samuel said, give or take. She considered this. "It suits people," she said. "The house. It was built for people." "My father built it," Samuel said. "He had 7 children. Said he built every room for the noise it would hold." Sarah smiled. "Rose alone is covering at least 3 rooms worth." "She is," Samuel agreed. They sat with that for a moment. "I want to say something," Sarah said. Her voice had the careful quality it got when she'd prepared what she was going to say, and was now delivering it exactly as intended. "And I want you to let me finish before you respond." "All right," Samuel said. "When Thomas died," she said, "I told myself that the only thing I had left to do in this world was get my children somewhere safe. That was it. That was the whole of what I had left to want. Not for myself, just for them." She paused. "I stopped thinking about anything beyond that. I think I know that I stopped thinking about myself as a person who deserved anything beyond that." Samuel said nothing. He had agreed to let her finish. "And then we ended up on your land," she said. "And you left food under a tree, and you sat down in a shed, and you ran into a fire." She stopped. Her voice was level, but it was working to stay that way. "And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I started thinking about myself again. Not just as Ethan's mother, or Jacob's mother, or the woman who was going to figure out how to survive. As myself." She turned to look at him. "I don't entirely know what to do with that." Samuel set his coffee cup on the porch railing. He turned to look at her directly. "Sarah," he said, "I've been alone for 19 years, and I told myself it was by choice, and I believed it right up until a 9-year-old boy spread his arms out at me in the dark, and I realized I had been lying to myself every single day." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not in any hurry. But I want you to know that you are all 5 of you, the best thing that has ever happened to this ranch, or to me. And I intend to spend a considerable amount of time proving that if you'll allow it." The porch was very quiet. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "You have a significant head start," she said, "on the proving." "I know," he said. "I plan to keep going." Something broke open in her face. Then, not in a sad way, not in a frightened way, but in the way something breaks open when it has been held closed for a very long time, and the person holding it finally decides that keeping it closed is no longer worth the effort. She laughed. It was a real laugh. The first completely unguarded one he'd heard from her, surprised out of her by the simplicity of what he'd said, bright and real, and nothing like the composed, managed expressions she'd shown him up until now. "I thought it was the finest thing he'd heard in 19 years. He smiled. The full version, not the corner-of-the-mouth thing that Rose had startled out of him weeks ago, but the complete expression of a man who was genuinely uncomplicated happy in this specific moment. Sarah looked at his face when he smiled, and went slightly still the way people do when they see something unexpected and find it more affecting than they'd anticipated. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. The weeks that followed had a quality Samuel had no existing name for. Not the flat, workable quiet of his 19 solitary years, but something textured and alive and constantly in motion. The ranch had noise now. It had the particular noise of 4 children at different stages of childhood, doing what children do when they begin to feel safe, pushing boundaries, testing permanence, making the kind of demands on a place and a person that are actually a form of trust. Jacob had become Samuel's shadow at the fence line. Not Ethan's careful observational hovering. Jacob got in, got his hands dirty, asked questions in rapid succession, and retained every answer with the focused hunger of a boy who had decided exactly what he wanted to know and was going to know it thoroughly. Samuel gave him a proper pair of work gloves and showed him how to set a post correctly, and the pride on the boy's face when the first one went in straight and solid was something Samuel put away somewhere important. Lily organized the lending library with her mother, and had already within 3 weeks of its opening developed strong opinions about which books were being mistreated by borrowers and what should be done about it. She kept a log. She wrote letters to borrowers who were late. The letters were extremely polite and extremely firm, and 2 of the recipients' grown men had come to Samuel separately to mention that the Brooks girl wrote a formidable letter. Rose had annexed Samuel completely and without apology. She followed him through the yard in the mornings. She sat beside him at every meal she had taken to calling him simply "my cowboy" in conversation as a possessive noun, which she deployed in front of other people without any awareness that it might require explanation. She had also decided that the cat which had survived the fire by the simple expedient of not being anywhere near it was named Biscuit, and that Biscuit's primary responsibility was to sleep on Samuel's porch, which Biscuit had accepted with equanimity. Ethan was different. Not distant, not the way he'd been in the early days on guard, arms out watching for the threat, but quieter with it, processing something large. Samuel noticed, but did not press because he recognized the particular interior work Ethan was doing, the work of a child who has been the man of the family and is trying to figure out what he is allowed to be when someone else steps in. He let it go at its own pace. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when Ethan came to find him at the water trough and said without preamble, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," Samuel said. The boy stood beside him and looked at the trough for a moment. Then, "Do you love my mother?" Samuel was still. He looked at Ethan. The boy looked back, serious, direct, no evasion in him, just the flat, honest courage of someone who had decided the question needed to be asked and was asking it. "Yes," Samuel said, simply without qualification, because Ethan was not a person you gave qualified answers to. Ethan nodded slowly. "Does she know?" "I believe so," Samuel said. "Yes." Another nod. The boy's jaw shifted the way it did when he was working through something. "My father was a good man," Ethan said. "I want you to know that. He was a good father, and he loved us." "I know that," Samuel said. "I've never thought otherwise." "I know you haven't," Ethan said. I'm not saying it because I'm worried you did. I'm saying it because—" He stopped, started again. "I'm saying it because I needed to say it out loud to you. So you knew that I know the difference between my father and what you are." He paused. "What you've become." Samuel waited. "I don't want you to think I'm replacing him," Ethan said. His voice was controlled and deliberate. "I'm not. He's my father, and that doesn't change." He looked at Samuel directly. "But I think you might be family too, at the same time. And I needed to know if that was all right with you." Samuel looked at this 9-year-old boy who had stood in the dark with his arms spread wide to protect 4 scraps of food, who had handed him a drawing through a fence post, who had called him by a name, the quiet cowboy, that had somehow become the truest thing anyone had ever called him. "Ethan," Samuel said, "that is more than all right with me." The boy breathed out. Something released in his shoulders, something that had been held there a long time. "Okay," he said. He picked up a spare section of trough pipe that needed moving and carried it to the barn because Ethan Brooks processed profound emotional moments by immediately doing something useful, and Samuel understood this completely because he was exactly the same way. Hargrove came in person in November. He arrived with the finalized legal documents, the library arrangement, the residency paperwork, the corrected land record, and he sat in Samuel's kitchen and spread them across the table and went through each one with the methodical care of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years and took the weight of paper seriously. Sarah sat beside Samuel. Ethan had been told to take the younger children outside, which he did, though Samuel caught the boy's eyes at the window twice during the meeting. "Everything is in order," Hargrove said. He paused, his hands flat on the documents. "There's one additional matter I'd like to raise. Informally." Samuel said, "Go ahead." Hargrove looked at both of them, at Samuel, then at Sarah, then back at Samuel, with the expression of a man choosing his words with professional precision. "The legal framework we've built is solid, but it is at its core a workaround. It protects Mrs. Brooks and the children from external interference and establishes her right to be here. What it doesn't do," he paused, "is give the children's situation the permanence that a more formal arrangement would provide." Sarah went still. "I'm not suggesting anything," Hargrove said carefully. "I'm observing, and I'm observing that the people in this room have built something over the past several months that the law tends to recognize more fully in certain arrangements than in others. I'll leave it at that." He began gathering his papers. Samuel looked at Sarah. Sarah was looking at the table. After Hargrove left, the house was quiet, in the particular way it got when the children were outside and the adult space contracted to just the two of them. Samuel stood at the kitchen counter, and Sarah stood near the doorway, and neither of them pretended the conversation hadn't happened. "He's not wrong," Samuel said. Sarah looked at him. "I'm not saying it because of the legal framework," Samuel said. "I want to be clear about that first." "I know," she said. "I'm saying it because I mean it." He turned to face her fully. "Sarah, I want to build something here, with you and with those 4 children. Not a workaround, not a legal arrangement, a life." He held her gaze. "I know it's soon. I know you've had less time than you needed to grieve everything you lost. I know I'm not a simple man, and this ranch is not a simple life." He paused. "But I love you, and I love those children, and I would like if you're willing to stop finding ways around that and simply make it what it is." Sarah Brooks looked at him for a long time. She had the expression of someone who had prepared themselves very carefully for a world in which good things did not happen, who had built careful, sensible walls against wanting too much, and was now standing in front of evidence that the walls had not held, and was deciding whether to be afraid of that or not. She decided. "Yes," she said, clearly, without qualification. Samuel crossed the kitchen and took both her hands in his. Outside, Rose screamed with laughter about something. Jacob shouted. Lily's voice carried over both of them, and Ethan's lower tone underneath it. The sound of 4 children on a ranch in late autumn, alive and loud and entirely at home. Samuel looked at Sarah's face. She was looking back at him. "I should probably tell the children," she said. "Rose already knows," Samuel said. "She's been calling me her cowboy for 6 weeks." Sarah laughed that real, unguarded laugh, and leaned her forehead briefly against his shoulder, and Samuel held on to both her hands, and thought that if this was what the remainder of his life looked like, he had been given far more than he had any right to expect. They got married on a Saturday in December, with the ground hard from frost, and the air cold and clear, and the church hall full of the people of Harlan County, including Samuel noted without comment. Calloway and his wife sitting in the 3rd row, and Abigail Turner in the front, organizing everything with her characteristic quiet efficiency. Holt was not there. Patterson was not there. Nobody mentioned them. Rose was the flower girl, and took the responsibility with enormous seriousness. Lily played a hymn on the church piano, with a composure that impressed everyone present. Jacob stood next to Ethan during the ceremony, with his hands clasped and his chin up, wearing his best shirt, and a pair of new boots that Samuel had measured his feet for, and ordered from the cobbler in Austin, without telling anyone. Ethan stood at the front beside Samuel, not because anyone had asked him to, because he had positioned himself there quietly before the ceremony began. And when Samuel looked at him, the boy looked back with those serious old eyes, and gave one small deliberate nod. "I'm here, standing beside you." Samuel nodded back. After the ceremony, after the supper and the music, and Rose falling asleep in Samuel's arms well before the evening was finished. After all of it, they came home to the ranch in the dark, and Samuel carried Rose inside and put her in her bed, and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the 4 children sleeping in the rooms that had been empty for 19 years. He stood there a long time. In the spring, he started building. Not the shed. Not a new structure planned from the ground up on the far side of the creek where the land was level and the cottonwood trees made shade in the afternoon. A proper house big enough for a family that intended to grow into it, with rooms he built with specific people in mind. A room for Ethan with a window that faced east because the boy was always up before the light. A room for Jacob with enough space along one wall to store the tools he was collecting, with the focus of someone who had decided that building things was what he was put on earth for. A room for Lily with good light for reading. A room for Rose that Samuel built slightly larger than the others, because Rose was going to need the space that was simply obvious. Ethan helped him raise the beams. Every morning before school, the boy would come to the building site and take up position wherever the work was happening, and do whatever needed doing with the same quiet competence he'd been bringing to everything since the day they met. One morning, working the long beam into position along the south wall, Ethan said, without looking up from the joint he was fitting, This is going to be a good house." "It is," Samuel said. "Papa built our old house," Ethan said. "He wasn't as fast as you, but he was very precise." "Precision's better than speed," Samuel said. Ethan looked up briefly. "That's what he used to say." They worked in silence for a moment. Then Ethan said, "I think he'd be glad. About this." He fitted the joint. "About all of it. He was that kind of man." Samuel looked at the boy. "He raised a good son," Samuel said. "That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man he was." Ethan pressed his mouth together, held the joint, held himself. Then he nodded once and kept working, and they built the wall together in the bright spring morning without saying anything else, which was exactly the right thing. The sign appeared on a Saturday. Samuel came around the corner of the new house to find Ethan standing beside the front gate post with a piece of cedar in his hands and a look of studied casualness that communicated clearly that this was not casual at all. The other three children were ranged behind him with the suppressed energy of people who have been waiting for something and are very close to the end of their ability to wait quietly. Sarah was on the porch. "We made something," Ethan said. He held out the cedar piece. Samuel took it. It was a sign hand-carved, the letters cut with the careful, uneven precision of someone who had worked very hard on this and was not yet done learning, but had given everything he had to it. The wood still smelled of fresh shavings. Ethan had sanded the edges smooth. Samuel read it. He read it once, and then he stood there and read it again, and by the second time, he understood that he was not going to be able to keep his face arranged the way he usually kept his face, that this was beyond that particular skill of his, that whatever was happening in his chest was simply going to be visible to everyone present, and he was going to have to let that be what it was. Walker family, built by love not blood. Rose beside him now, she had materialized the way she always did, silently and suddenly tugged on his hand. "Do you like it?" she demanded, with the directness of someone for whom subtlety has never been a priority. Samuel crouched down to her level. He looked at her face. Those enormous dark eyes. The braids she never let anyone redo properly after the first hour. The absolute certainty with which she occupied every space she entered. And then he looked up at Jacob, who was watching him with quiet hope. And at Lily, who had pressed both hands over her mouth, and at Ethan, who was standing straight and still and giving nothing away, except that his ears had gone red at the tops. And he looked at Sarah on the porch, who was watching all of them, with her hands folded together and the most completely peaceful expression he had ever seen on her face. Peace that had been earned the hard way, through everything they'd been through. Peace that knew exactly what it had cost, and had decided it was worth every cent. Samuel Walker, who had not cried in 19 years, did not fight it. He let it come. He held the sign in one hand and put the other arm around Rose, and he let the tears run the way a man does when he has held something so tightly for so long that releasing it is both a grief and the greatest relief of his life. Rose patted his face very seriously with both hands. "It's okay, cowboy," she told him. "We're here now." "I know," Samuel said. His voice was not entirely steady. "I know you are." Ethan came and crouched beside him on the other side, and Jacob and Lily came close, and Sarah came down from the porch and put her hand on his shoulder, and for a moment they were all of them in a cluster on the ground in front of the new house in the spring light. And it was not dignified, and it was not composed, and it was entirely, completely, exactly right. Later, Samuel hung the sign on the gatepost himself. He set it level, and he drove the nails in clean, and he stepped back and looked at it. Walker family, built by love not blood. He had spent 19 years believing that what he had lost could not be replaced. He had been wrong, but not in the way he'd expected to be wrong, not because something equal had come along, but because something entirely different had arrived. Something he could not have imagined. Something that did not ask him to forget anything, or replace anyone, or be anything other than exactly who he was, which was a 50-year-old rancher with scarred hands, and 19 years of solitude and more love than he had known was still in him. It had arrived hungry at the edge of his property in the dark. It had arrived in the shape of 4 children and a woman with a list of debts and a jaw that didn't drop even when everything else did. It had arrived because a boy spread his arms wide and said, "Please." Samuel Walker had been a man who believed he would die alone on this land. He died instead, surrounded by noise and argument and music, and the particular chaos of a house that holds many people who love each other and are not afraid to say so. He died with Rose's hand in his, and Ethan's steady presence beside him, and 3 generations of the family they had chosen, not inherited, not stumbled into by accident of birth, but chosen deliberately, one act of decency at a time. The sign outlasted all of them, and every person who ever passed through that gate and read those words understood something true about how the greatest things in a life are built, not from what you are given, but from what you choose to give. Not from blood. From love. From the decision made again every single day to stay.